Hello everyone, today we talk about the Carolingian scriptoria, in fact manuscript production in the 8th, 9th, mostly 9th century. An aspect of medieval culture which I had the fortune, albeit was definitely not my favorite subject to study a bit in paleography, in codicology. Now actually they're amazing subjects, telling the truth, just the basics are somehow hard, especially from a theoretical point of view, that apparently for people usually the easier one is that I was told I strangely had a good eye for it, even with relatively few practice. Definitely having to learn by heart terms that have been used to describe, say, by contemporary scholars to describe a certain nexus between the various scripts of all the Middle Ages is not one of the most thrilling things ever. But getting to know manuscripts, having worked on some of them, having touched them, having properly studied their life, right, their secrets, right, not just in fact paleographically but also archaeologically as a codex itself, is really charming. Is really fascinating. Never worked actually on Carolingian manuscripts. I was given something from the 15th century normally, and something more ancient in actual monastery when during my apprenticeship or as a medievalist. And it may seem like a boring topic for those who are more like me, just about war and swords and sieges and all this stuff. But on Schwerpunkt, I think I have habituated you a bit with everything, because it's always important to have a comprehensive picture of the world to understand really a lot. Most, of course, of the pictures, for example, I use in Carolingian warfare videos come from the beautifully illuminated manuscripts of this time. They reveal you a world, right? And they make you also reflect on the people who were behind them, behind their writing, behind their making in general, right? Just even as codex, the genocide of of sheep that was caused by medieval manuscripting, at least before trees mostly were used of that when paper came around and wouldn't substitute parchment completely for, in fact, quite a long time. In any case, all the world that revolved, especially at this time in history, in these centuries, around, again, manuscripts that cost a lot. But I mean, really a lot, right? And even considering, in fact, the economy of that world, this makes you realize how important for these people knowledge was, because manuscripts were really a fortune, as we'll see now. It was rare at this point to have script libraries with more than, say, 60, 70 volumes. Those were a marvel. Generally speaking, we've seen how the classical legacy was salvaged throughout this time, that it's not true, in fact, that even, say, in the early Middle Ages, there was, in high Middle Ages actually by this point, almost, that there was no circulation of knowledge or written material, or just that monks copied the stuff that remained in some kind of dusty armchair, let's say, that wouldn't be opened by anyone, right? Definitely, this was a world in which, and especially in Carolingian times with the Renovatio Imperii, of course, classical legacy, and also naturally its theological background was recovered, reinforced, was starting being discussed at a pretty high level of culture of the Carolingian court that, as in brought together a bit the best of Europe of the time, intelligentsia-wise, from different countries, even outside the Carolingian Empire. Think about Alcuin of York, but you have Visigoths, you have Saxons, you have Longobards, and more. And there is a general let's say, attention, of course, paleographically, codicologically, towards this time, and that it's not as productive as it was, and especially as improving in terms, especially of standardized script and properly, the rationalization of manuscript production, the dramatic boosting from a quantitative point of view that the Carolingian Empire did. There are some aspects that we still, of course, do not fully understand, and this is a bit like for all the history of the time, but there are interesting points to be made, so naturally we will make multiple videos about paleography, codicology. Actually, let me note that, because every time I think of a new playlist that I could create, I write it down so that I don't forget it, and every once in a while I create new ones when I'm bored, to inflate my views unfairly. But I don't care, of course, because that's still fair, telling the truth. In any case, when we think about the heart of such manuscript production, so in this case a Carolingian scriptorium, we again know a relatively few about its layout. We have, of course, various authors talking about that. Then there are some kind of, in fact, same illuminations that mostly, as you can see also from the images I upload here for this video, were a bit mimicking kind of aesthetically the past, even in costumes, in kind of in tools, writing tools, even the reading platforms, whatever, are depicted and hadn't changed dramatically, by the way. So we do have an idea of something. What is very interesting is to study this. We will do it at some point, like within the monastic life itself and how it was organized as such. Didn't make so many videos about that, but we're going to, because there is all a history of how knowledge, in fact, was preserved from, say, the very early medieval zootecule of some, I don't know, kind of early 7th century Francia, let's put, and say the ensuing Carolingian Renaissance, as it was also called, because of this dramatic contribution we were pointing out before to the standardization of a Western European writing, written culture proper in terms of script, also of the updating the language proper. We'll see how important it was at this point to, even just in the moment of the copy, to be skilled philologically to understand what you were copying. Some consider that some manuscripts existing at the time, naturally much larger number than today, came straight from the ancient world, right? Mostly from late antiquity, which is also the base, mostly the Unchalis, and in fact the Carolingian script, right, that they thought was the one used at the time of Cicero, Augustus, but that was actually from the later Roman Empire, at least. But that script, for example, didn't have separations between letters. If anything, they used a little dot, but sometimes it wasn't there. So if you didn't know Latin too well, which could happen, especially for the novices, whoever was put to do this, because it's mostly mechanical function, right? They didn't even necessarily know how to read. They had to, or to write. I mean, to read partially would at that point, but reading, copying, writing were all different things. Like today, we are habituated to do that kind of very easily, but at the time, it wasn't considered like that. Everybody had a specialty, and generally speaking, of course, reading was done in a much different way from today. Also much less, because there was much less to read in the first place, and life was somehow more action-based, even for these monks in their contemplative life. In any case, when we look at some authors like Hildemar, right, of this time, so he tells us quite openly, like, the tools of the scribe, as you can imagine, are fundamentally the pen, the reed, so that's the point fundamentally, then the pen knife to sharpen the instrument, then a razor, that was important also to sometimes, like, literally creating the various folly, right? The various choirs that were written on before the manuscript was put together physically, right? Because naturally had to be sewed basically together, and that could, just as you can understand when you read a book, when the internal part of the text is difficult sometimes to read without opening, to imagine just writing on that. So it was all done with a very specific method that we can reconstruct. Today we do not talk properly about this. Then there was pumice, which was used as an eraser fundamentally. The parchment was normally, it varied in quality naturally, but some of the finest codices were realized in, with an extreme attention just properly to the value of that. They had multiple, folly, etc., or other pieces, but they still cost a lot, right? Especially veal, right? It was the most sold after, like, at least it was the most costly. Then there was kind of cheaper parchment. We're talking still about killed animals, right? That were naturally used, in the other parts, aside from the skin, for other purpose, but that still cost, right? They were to be drawn from somewhere in the first place, and worked, and took a long time, a lot of calories, a lot of energy. Again, we're not specifically talking about this, but just to give you an idea, it wasn't that simple like today, like at least in the availability and in the relative amount of work that must be done in order to achieve that. So then you had the parchment, the other things which like other tools that made the book. The Carolingian plan of a monastery preserved at St. Gall, which is how they thought they would have to do the monastery eventually, and it would be different, but I inserted a picture of that also here, shows at this projectually, so conceptually, theoretically, a scriptorium with a central table and 7 writing desks beside 6 windows, right? So there was immediately, like, the idea of having an organizing center, right? At every other, say, monk had to. So sometimes there were some laymen hired by the same monastery for this, but they were mostly monks, especially at this point. They would have to work for kind of a greater purpose. There was a hierarchy in here. The work was checked by experienced eyes, let's say, and everything was done for, of course, putting together the whole thing, which had to be done with a special expertise. The let's say more than 7 monks thus may, according to St. Gall's plan, have been writing in the scriptorium at the same time. We know that some scribes even used some portable desks on the occasion. There is been an estimate of the amount of scribes that operated specifically at St. Gall, and a certain amount of time, and how many manuscripts they could produce, right? St. Gall seemingly had 21 scribes between the 50s and the 70s of the 8th century, 80, right, which is a lot, under the abbot Waldo, and around 100 under the abbot Godesbury, when some 70 volumes were copied. Between the 70s of the 8th century and the 30s of the 9th, at Corbie, there were also around 100 scribes active, right? Colophons reveal, sometimes at least, how long it took to copy a manuscript, right? The colophon for those who don't know, that is the last kind of say final signature of some sort. Say not signature as such, but the signature in some. It's mostly famous for the printing times, like, but was it tells who printed that and all the other indications relative to that. Also, at the end, they could add some kind of information, because again, every manuscript, as we'll see now, was, especially at that point, felt to be like a unique piece of some sort. It was a little work of art in itself. There was a tendency towards standardization, but it was never thought as a final end, right, as an absolute need. And it was mostly also a journey of the copyist, in a way, in a spiritual sense, because, as you know, since Saint Benedict's time, that was also part of the work that, next to prayer, was meant to be, and so a sort of spiritual training of some sort. In 793, at the Abbey of St. Gall, the 23 folios of the Lex Alemannorum, that we also discussed in our Germanic history videos, were copied in 2 days. Right. In 823, Augustine's commentary on the Epistle of John, the leaves are the individual pages that are part of the book, right? Of 20 lines. On it was all a kind of geometric pattern that they mostly marked with a graphite. It could be simply cancelled in order to give the spaces precisely in a geometrical way to write. Was copied, so this was also part of the work included here, was copied by 2 scribes in Regensburg in a week, right? The 182 leaves of 32 lines at the monastery of Valenciennes, 59 were copied in the year 806 from July the 1st to August the 4th. There is a canon's manuscript of 218 leaves, which was copied at Salzburg over almost 5 months. So at a rate of like 2 pages and say a bit less than half a day. A manuscript of saints' lives of 291 leaves today is preserved at the Library of Bruxelles, numbered 8,216 to 18, was copied by a scribe from Regensburg in 819, interestingly enough, during a military campaign against the Avars, because naturally the monks also moved together with the army sometimes, and so work didn't stop for them. And it lasted basically the entire campaign, because it says from June the 2nd to September the 12th. Right, so this was part of the kind of, again, still contemplative spiritual training necessary even for those who traveled with the army. They wouldn't stop to perform their duty just for nothing, right? Naturally, when we look at the increase in speed of copying, we have to realize there was a loss in quality, which was, as we were just saying, proportional, generally speaking, also to the worth of the material, like other reasons, the commission, whichever need you had to get this done more or less quickly, right? So looking at this data, we can reasonably assess that the average speed of a skilled scribe could bring to the copy of up to 7 pages of, say, 25 lines in a single day, right? Which is a fair work, right? A fair day of work. Again, they were told to write in that specific calligraphy. Everything was done in a very precise, standardized, patterned way. Everything was properly serving to the purpose. And mistakes did occur, right? But they were also not very frequent, given the speed that they gave themselves in order to avoid them in the first place. They were always acceptable. We can understand also how precious the thing was on this page. The supply of parchment. Again, this mostly fell in the same monastery, because they had land, right? People, animals, even military retinues, of course. And the of course the cost, but also the quantity properly of animals could vary. The excellent uniform white leaves of the Tours Bibles that were copied from the 30s to the 60s of the 9th century were like some of the finest, right, you could find across the entire Carolingian Empire. And there were those crude skins still with holes. Some I uploaded as pictures, where you can still see the hair of the animal even still attached, right? And this is the lowest kind that you can find, especially in the 8th century manuscripts that were pre-Carolingian reform. The quality of the parchment had to do also very much on the kind of the animal skin. That there could be imperfections. This could be treated in some ways, but of course you would try to pick kind of the finest skin, always maintaining that it had hopefully also to be homogeneous by a degree. So it's also how it was treated. We'll see it another time, but it could happen. And seeing, for example, the bulbs still there. The fact that, of course, even the way you treated the manuscript could highlight more or less. You cannot easily understand what animal that is, by the way, through the color. Normally, this kind of skin, the distribution, it's somehow very easy. At some point, we still take little samples to look at them microscopically, but generally speaking, you can easily look just and see which understand which animal that was. This may be important as far as classification of these manuscripts, stats. You want to know something also indirectly about history of economics, things like these. In any case, at Corbie, the sheep on the Abbe's estates were tithed and kept in 10 flocks at the same Abbe and controlled by a master. This could help kind of selecting them better, may already probably with some eye understanding which kind of skin was the best. But the most important thing, again, was homogeneity overall for a single codex, especially the most precious ones. There was also a lay parchment maker on some occasions. For example, at Bobbio was the case. In the Italic kingdom, generally speaking, there were more laymen around, just habitually interacting with the monasteries. So you understand, these were people living outside the abbey in their life, but selling their service, as in this case, parchment makers, illuminators, whatever, right? And it was a legitimate job that evidently, from this statistic evidence, was also something at the time. A 2-month-old lamb skin, to be quite brutal, measures something like between, at least in the way it's cut, a rectangle right over the, say, aside from the cuts of the legs that are not included. Normally you can see this because eventually the skin is cut in a perfectly rectangular way, so you don't see the anatomy of the animal. But it's something between 30 and 60. 30 per 60 centimeters. That is, in fact, this sheet folded in half to produce 2 leaves and consequently 4 pages. Right, the simplest folding of a surface. So while most Carolingian manuscripts were copied on sheepskin, the earliest books copied at the Abbey of Loches were copied on calf, for example. This was also typical somehow in insular volumes. This again just depends on some aesthetical preferences. That the quality could vary at some point, but let's say that there was also practicality behind that. Sometimes you can't even distinguish, again, as I was saying before, what animal it is clearly, and you can get different things on the basis of the treatment on the animal and so on. Schell and Echternach used goat skin. Also, early manuscripts from Corbie and Saint Gall used goats. The earliest, however, charters produced at Saint Gall were copied on sheep, goat and calf being used only from the 60s of the 8th century. The parchment was probably, in the sense, sort of plus scraps from the stocks prepared for copying the books as well, because they tried to essentially never throw away anything to save some resource. Parchment was prepared mostly by soaking the skin in lime for 3 days so that you would defat it, for which it would also be scraped to eliminate any kind of the majority of the impurities. So you would leave just the skin. Ideally, it was yet to be refined completely. And first of all, this had to be also let being dried, right, under tension, by the way, so that the skin would be all kind of as smooth as possible, because that was the ultimate goal, so you stretch it. And at some point, some of this material could be lost, so it could be some lesions, damage, some sort. At Saint Gall, a colophon suggests that some scribes prepared their own parchment for writing, right? So there could be some also personalized ways of doing this, depending on what they were writing specifically. At Corbie, by the mid-9th century, the flesh side of the parchment, that was the best one, right, was uppermost at the outside of the quire, right, into which the pages were assembled. Elsewhere, the hair side was uppermost. This was, as we've seen, there were more, you could see the bulbs, etc. So you can immediately, even to the eye, realizing which one is flesh and the other, which one is hair, practically, sides. There could be an impression that the writing may be done on the hair side, specifically with a ridge on the flesh, or both hair and flesh sides may be grooved and ridged, specifically. This is a way we can use to distinguish different centers. They had different practices at different time, and compare it. And yes, we can become that precise. When people ask, even just philological, how do we know things? What do we know? That we know a lot. We know a freaking lot. The problem is we know too much sometimes. At least still not knowing most of what we would like to know, but enough to complicate things, right? Or to reveal, however, a lot in the process, right? I'm very surprised when people say, but how do we know that the text was original from the classical antiquity? Well, how do you know that? I mean, philologically speaking, do you think that an Aristotle could be written when they found the manuscripts back in the Middle Ages? to translate. How can you pretend historiography to be so naive in front of the sheer scale of historical, linguistical, philosophical, archaeological info that we have, literary, cultural, whatever. So sometimes we underestimate history, and this is a problem that we've had. Is there always this sort of conspiracy that historians are not telling the truth for some reason? But also the problem with historians is that they say things too well, leaving other things out, right? But the things they say, they are pretty neatly researched, right? This is the point. The main problem we have now is that people, generally speaking, tend to think that, I don't know, they're smarter than experts just because, not just to feel less, right? Pretending that there is so much you can learn by yourself without actually doing the actual job that takes to do this kind of things. In any case, you understand, for all these manuscripts, there had to be a substantial amount of pastoral, expansion properly of pastoral farming, especially on monastic estates, to keep the parchment adequately supplied. This boosted also, for example, systems of monastic rent, right? Manuscript production was so important that entire manuscripts had to reorganize the way they rented their land, so that it could specifically help manuscript, properly the parchment supply, right? That is how significant this production was. In his commentary on the Rule of Saint Benedict, written around 840, Ildemar describes a manuscript of 30 sheets of parchment, which was to be sold for 60 denarii. Right, that is not a few. The survey detailing the estates of the Abbey of Prüm values a young pig at 4 denarii, a ship with its fleece at 50. Okay, so you have an idea that of how a Carolingian manuscript could cost as much as 15 pigs, which was an awful lot, right? If you ask a peasant to give you 15 pigs, it would have been a blood loss, right? 4 mature ship are 120 days of work on the ram's estate. Well, it is all comparable, right? This all to produce something like 30 shipskins, right? And this is particularly telling for how costly it was. And again, it's very few if you look at it, right? But that's how high the demand really was, and tells you how worth really parchment was for creating manuscripts specifically. Not only did this parchment vary, so we can't be standard in absolute terms, but not all of this material was used in the same way. Also, banally, the scribes were not all that good. In 789, for example, Charlemagne, that cared particularly about the ecclesiastical reform, that had to pass through such manuscript standards, decreed that the liturgical manuscripts, so those that they thought literally had to elevate the destiny of the empire through prayers, through as if this medium would have amplified the effect of, being crowned by God through the Holy Ghost. Gospel books, psalters, the same, missals, right? So all what was needed for this to be copied only by the elderly monks, right? And written carefully, right? The elderly, if not probably say the mature ones, because the elderly maybe would have also a shaky hand, but say experienced scribes, right? So people that had done this for a long time, so there had been a precision about this. The Franks were extremely rigid about this specifically, and that's also most of the success, the clamorous success of their ecclesiastical reform that basically took over Europe while the empire dissolved, right, is a testament to the cultural achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance. In 805, so over the decades, Charlemagne, always keeping to regulate these things, ordered that scribes had not to write badly, literally. Right, there was a sense that this had to be insisted upon. Remember that up to the 8th century, the monastic standards, also in terms of literacy or banally knowing Latin, even reading the Bible, were dramatically low. That's also why Charlemagne, the Carolingians, especially him and Louis the Pious, were unsurprisingly also the emperors that had more power historically, had a more enlightened vision. They realized, as we explained many times, that the church was the only instrument that, say, of state could be effectively centralized, as opposed to the laity that still saw everything privately. So even through the fact of establishing these monastic disciplines, as far as the manuscripts were copied, was crucial to maintain those standards. There is all a worldview behind this, by the way. Louis the Pious wanted the decrees of his Reformed Council of 816, quote, copied clearly and openly, lest they be corrupted by the error of the scribe or abridged by anyone. Right? Because the point is that such scribal norms were also social norms at the same time. Correcting a mistake graphically meant to fix something, an error in society as well. The mindset of the time, especially the one of a Frank, is that this script was magic by some sort, right? It was a meaning, like just in the runes, right? And the Saint Christian view, the verbum is literally the word, the incarnated, right? So, of course, the sacred texts had something to, there is a lot in Carolingian geography about the miracles. Think about Saint Boniface that is killed by the Frisians that wanted to look at the chests that these monks brought, and they thought there was gold in them, and they found the manuscripts. But that was real gold, if you understand what we just said about its cost. But of course it was something going beyond. It was the ideology of the Catholic Empire, as we were explaining these days, just yesterday, for example, about the conversion of the Saxons. Think how important. We talked just yesterday about Louis the Pious, literally, likely him, or maybe Louis the German, we don't know, but it's as if it was the same thing in terms of royal policy, literally issuing that the Heliand to be written in Old Saxon, in fact, in the local language. So to compromise, to try to Christianize these peoples fast, right? So all these needed books, things. Well, most of the stuff was, as you understand, also just read by monks, by priests, to others. There was a choral, collective society at this point. Most of this stuff was transmitted verbally. Naturally, if you were not so dramatically versed in Latin, you could still make mistakes and thus mispronouncing something. Thus you also had to write precisely so that who would read could not be facilitated in an eventual mistake. This thing of correcting errors, right, was properly issued by as an order to Charlemagne, urging it to the clergy in 789. Hildemar states that if the manuscript's readers have errors or are not properly punctuated, then the lector reading during the office, the spiritual office, need not to be punished for mistakes in reading, which is also kind of strange, because at that point you would still pretend that those who read would just have to do it passively at that point. Of course, if somebody made a mistake, a written mistake, you could stumble on it, but you should at least hopefully be able to read it. Because otherwise you couldn't read, to fix the mistake, and to read the Bible, the sacred texts, and understanding them properly. And again, up to the previous century, this had been a real issue in the Frankish clergy that had a pretty superficial understanding of the scriptures, also because they didn't understand Latin well. Right, this system reformed the whole thing and brought, in fact, also classical knowledge and philology and kind of literary standards much up, right? And that's what the Carolingian Renaissance was, as far as connecting ever more all of Western Christendom achieved in doing, right? Literally through spreading further a lingua franca for all the empire. And there had to be a brother, however, according to Ildemar, in the case of the lector, who had to stand beside him to correct him in case something was misread. So at least somebody had to know, somebody had to check and fix it, hopefully, in general. Abbot Murdram at Corbie, in a volume of his Bible, which is, by the way, the earliest datable example of Caroline minuscule, which is a big deal. So we're talking about properly the moment and the makers, right, of the Caroline script. It's basically the same one that we use, mind that. Said that he commissioned the manuscript for the love of God, of course, but also for the convenience of the readers. That is to say, this format, right, comes out properly for facilitating the read, right, the access to the truth, to the sacred content. So all this depended, as much as in the traditional theology of the light, of reason, of order, of discipline, of authority, of hierarchy, by using a clear script and layout. Right, the quality of the text, the ideas of how written language could guide the reader were all there. There was a didactic emphasis put in this. And again, they were basically realigning their script, uniforming it, kind of standardizing it, for also as far as the layout, the same books, etc. were concerned, because again, it was a great empire again in Western Europe from the time of the empire, whereas in between, in the early Middle Ages, there had been mostly, as you know, a kind of further departure from a common standard. Every country had begun to have his own script. It was the Insular one, the Merovingian one, the Visigothic, the Langobardic, etc. So to the point that they wouldn't be able quite to read each other, even though they were writing Latin. And yes, Latin, as we've seen, was relatively imperfect, but it was still Latin. It was intelligible, but it linguistically, for the way it was written, but not in the way it was scripted, right? Because this traditions had just happened, right? Different countries produce different scripts because they have kind of different ideologies in mind. The Carolingians said, we need to govern this empire functionally, so we have to standardize the script. We govern of so many different people that have historically kind of different scripts. Yes, they are kind of similar. You could read it, right? They're not completely unintelligible. Also, it's obvious that the least relevant the manuscript, the most kind of badly written can be, right? So like when you're in school, you're writing the good copy and the bad copy, right? For the essay in class. Well, that's a bit the same thing. You don't want to stain too much the sheet. You don't want to, make mistakes. To have to wipe, say, with white ink, the thing. So it's a bit the same point, the same problem. You have to be intelligible. You have to be understandable for the others as well. With yourself, you can use. I use all kind of sort of strange ciphered code to write to myself, even when I make Schwerpunkt sketches. But again, I try at least to to deliver this content in an intelligible way. I do my minimum, let's put it this way, to be intelligible in English and to be clear about what I'm saying. Probably I don't succeed, but it's a concern. And civilizationally speaking, by scale, that this is there, right? There was, as we're saying, a hierarchy highlighted again by the internal organization of the scriptorium, which had like a boss there, like a head, a chief, that was tasked, as we've seen also in the central position, at least ideally in the plan of St. Gall, to correct the texts himself, right? For example, in description, requisitum est, meaning collated with the original. It is found, for example, at the ends of the quires of several Tour Bibles and other Tour manuscripts, along with evidence that the text has been corrected. So naturally, we do have texts with mistakes. I've seen them myself occasionally, and the point is that it's not a huge deal, right? Again, it depends who wrote that, how and why. For example, there were all certain systems of abbreviation that could vary. This could depend again on a local tradition, whatever. The important was being understood. Also, they weren't so fussy about form in absolute terms, right? They just had to deliver the thing functionally. That was their interest. It was merely ideal. They had to make this thing work. So of course, yeah, if there was a mistake, you could correct it, and somebody who read that could still say, "Oh, look, this has been corrected. That's the mistake the guy did. Let's hope I won't make it. If I copy a manuscript myself, I will remember that." So there was a function to that, and there were some kind of more cenographic texts, especially the great Bibles. For example, there are the Atlantic Bibles. There's something huge, elephantiac, like the largest manuscripts, at least produced in series, that dating to this times, that were a completely different thing. It's as if you had drawn a painting, right? There were again, the script was something, the illumination was something else. It was very complex to create a codex. At Salzburg, the monk Baldo corrected biblical commentaries. He added texts to manuscripts, letters by Augustine, Jerome, Alcuin. So he supplied glosses to Boethius and Alcuin's treatise on the Trinity. So again, the head was not just a technician. These were the same monks that studied there, that had an idea of also properly with manuscripts. They studied them. They observed them just in the way they were also structured, because the problem at some point was also creating some sort of miscellany in which you would have different works in the same manuscript. This was quite useful, even just to save space, to save let's say, to collect more stuff at a time. Sometimes we were having, because again, there were certain texts were used for studying proper, so they could be, so that they could have excerpta, or say, in fact, extracts, etc. And differently from the good show-off book that was used just like in a cathedral sense, right? Baldo from Salzburg wrote also the same Salzburg Annals of the time, which dealt with contemporary politics and war, because it told the story of how Charlemagne had conquered and ruled Bavaria, which was a big deal in Salzburg. And historically, I mean, the Bavarians had been there, that was an important connection with the Franks. Then there was the eastern frontier. Bavaria would become practically the capital of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom later on. I mean, at least it had in Regensburg, that we quoted also before, just as a monastic center, that it was provided with the capital of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom. So it was like important to just explain things historiographically in terms of script, whatever. Right. At Corbie, the librarian Adward corrected the texts of Cicero's philosophical writings. And this happened before a copy of the same writings was made in the same monastery. That is to say, this guy received for the first time this Ciceronian philosophical works, and he checked them before to correct that the copies that they had been handed down to were correct. Very often we don't know, we can't trace all like the genealogy of the manuscripts. Only God knows how they were passed down over the centuries in many ways. But they were aware of the fact that there had been mistakes in the copy on the long run, so they had to check the property of the language. Naturally, this guy had to be very well versed in Latin in general to understand at least some of the most, the conjunctives, these things. And again, it was dramatically important for them to be very, very, very well educated for those time standards. The same guy also corrected Augustine's City of God, by the way. At Ferrières, Lupus edited classical authors, and he noted at least the variations in the texts, in the copies that he had. He would check, especially the word division, because sometimes it was done in a messy way. The ligatures could be complicated to understand, and you had to confront them with each other to understand even sometimes what the hell they were writing. Supposedly, properly classical texts, if they had arrived from late antiquity, say, had to be looked at with this, of course, specific awareness of how that script on which the St. Carolingian one would be based, in fact, worked, what the rules were, getting habituated to them. And these are very famous names. I mean, Lupus of Ferrières, other characters that are, we also know, literally speaking. So we know their works, we know their life, their politics, right? Their monastic, their abbatiates as such. Most of the times, however, realized that the texts were corrected by anonymous people that actually were pretty damn smart, right? As smart as these ones, right? And also, there were also critics, etc. It's just that they wouldn't pass down to us as actual names. Maybe they did, but we don't know that it was them, right, to do this. And this is also fascinating. And again, you have no idea of how much you can learn from a single manuscript in all these various details. That's how thoroughly they're. I know people that just go in the worst possible detail, right, to in fact find out pretty impressive things. And consider that this is how we study also the Middle Ages at levels that, again, most people are. Also, as a historian, that's not my job, right? I know paleographers that are de facto also historians of literature, of authors, but in this sense, there are also biographers. They make a work on manuscripts that is utterly incredible, and they know, say, when this was written, where, in which place, how the author knew another manuscript, and how it could be made. I mean, the most complex, but I'm making it very simple compared to what they actually do. So it's the equivalent of what, I don't know, I do with reconstructing battles with every source and trying to toy with the various possibilities. But it requires time and a lot of competence indeed. Naturally, copies could also be made with the conscious awareness of the change that was required. For example, in Carolingian copies, word divisions was often emphasized because they were trying. You can see it in the script that every word is neatly separated one from another. Right, in Merovingian times, when there had been a script among the Franks, ligatures were very, very frequent, right? This literally distorted words, how they were written, the same letters were basically blended in one. That's how, for example, our etc. and right in the Nexus way is still, it's a medieval thing, right? It's an E and a T blended together. Imagine that this is done, and it is done in medieval manuscripts, also in Gothic, for example, when there was this need to compress all the volume of information in these books that were in enormous vessels of knowledge. Well, just given that parchment cost a real lot, right? They invented lots of abbreviations that, again, you must know, because if you read them immediately, you don't know what it is. And of course, you have to understand them in Latin, meaning that every word is subjectable to that by a degree, at least, especially certain terminations, not only. So you have to understand also from the grammar what kind of word that nexus can be. So in order to guess it, again, through the sense of the phrase in Latin, if you are lazy to remember which nexus that is. So there are all these tricks that we got habituated to. And the Carolingians want instead every word to be clear, limpid. It's, again, like in Roman times, in fact. Everything very well spelled out, clear, round, very staunch, also contrast, right? Black, very dark, at least ink, and very white parchment had to be, also achieved with a special treatment. There are some two, actually, manuscripts of natural history of Pliny the Elder that are preserved at the University of Leiden. And they are of, say, 130 folios. They contain basically the books from 21 to 32 of Pliny natural history. And a part of a volume was copied at a center in the northeast of France, so the Carolingian earthland, close to the court, to the imperial court, in fact. In another one counts 277 folios, containing the text copied by some scribes trained at Murbach and Luxeuil. So some folios of a consistent amount, right, almost, say, more than 160 of the former manuscript, the latter one, which is known as Lipsius 7, copy the wall of the previous manuscript. It was called the Vossianus instead. The first half of this text is now in Paris, by the way. And the Vossianus, so the first one, was corrected before it was copied, and then corrected again in the 9th century. So if you actually if you compare the two volumes side by side, you see how the scribes copied an exemplar, right? So these manuscripts were realized by copying the same text, right? To copy a difficult text quickly, right? You would mostly split the material in two quires, right? Which were assigned for copying, right? And when you look at this, you realize that both of them had been corrected also in the process. The Lipsius copy of the 19 quires of Vossianus was the product of at least 10 scribes. they would copy one or more squires. So as we've seen, these groups, right, were supervised by a leader, and some of them also just finished each other's work at some point. It was cyclic. It was a teamwork, evidently, to maximize the production. And in order to avoid mistakes, by the way, it's understood from the way they were written that they were very carefully copied, right? They went column by column, slowly. As we've seen, it was not a fast writing. Also because the letters required the characters required a specific, calligraphy to come out well, and everything has to look uniform, right? Every letter has to be, every character has to be equal to its equivalent, right? You can't have, I don't know, I draw an A in a certain way and then I will draw it in another way. No, everything had to look as if they had come out from a sort of print, right? And at the time, of course, they would have had means of printing, just not of making it work effectively, but in fact it was much easier to just learn how to write very well so that people wouldn't quite see even the difference. Because at a given site you had to see that they had to understand there were the same, right? You didn't have to see an heterogeneity, a deformity, an asymmetry, whatever, because that was bad scripting. And that's not what the Carolingians wanted. Again, it requires an enormous writing. There are people who make calligraphy nowadays, and you can see there how much precision, time, care they take. And consider these people at the time were also much more skilled in the first place, right? On average, they properly saw a much greater purpose to that, as opposed to what we do now. Right, and they knew how to work, again, to make this, not just to write, but to make the manuscript, which are two different things technically, right? And paradoxically, this actually makes you even a better writer because it has to mechanize further the function. According to rhythms times, for which you have to master the script in the first place, so you're already on a pro level. Right. Bear in mind the quires are simply the kind of booklets that are formed by using different foley, right, and that are bundled together to form like an entire manuscript. So if we look at even modern books, the ligature, how it's made, it's all different quires put together and just held by the greater, the rigid structure, the cover, right, to which they are usually glued, and so on. So everything here was done with specific techniques we can't digress on, but just to make you understand the point here is that there was, even in the copies, of course, a way of modifying the either the quires of the script according to, in fact, what you wanted to change, right? You could, for example, alter the size of the script, compressing at the end of the quires lest they run over and cause problems for the scribe. That, by the way, was copying the next quire, who was probably, as we've seen, working at the same time, right? So all scribes were also in this phase, in this copying phase, somehow tested in their book understanding, because again, in Carolingian times you had to standardize everything, but naturally from a world where manuscripts were already present in consistent numbered, but they were not so uniform in script and all, so you had to develop an eye to carry out this reform. And there were manuscript experts before the Carolingian reform that were called mostly monks, as you understand, that had to organize the thing, and that had to be able to recognize what a single, as we've seen, nexus ligature meant, how words were to be divided. So this, with a difference in the layout, could bring to organizational problems. They had to calculate, for example, how long the roughly how many letters on average that letters occupy a different width, right? That was the most important thing, and could be contained in a line. How many lines in a book? So from the original book you were copying, you had to kind of translate the layout. It's when, like in Word, you change the character size, right? You have to count there how long that is going to become in pages. So basically the same problems we have today, except at the time they had to calculate it empirically, and also with maths, theoretically of course, but still with an eye equipped that had to be functional to that. Again, you couldn't quite make too many mistakes at a time, because more pigs and sheep and goats to be slaughtered, and both in this that would have entailed, right? Just some example in conclusion about which letters, say which words could cause more confusion. For example, fontem instead of pontem. So accusative of fonts, that is the spring, and pons, that is bridge, right? The F and the P could look similar, say from a Merovingian script. We have more elaborated words such as aquar theopompus or aquas theopompus, two different things, or annibale, ablative, and hamnabale, right? It had nothing to do with each other, and etc. Right? So sometimes you could when you look at manuscripts, you do see all these exceptions. There are things about the scribe, about whichever script he still uses, because again, not everything is fully really standardized, right? The way that you can recognize this, like you have to get habituated to the way he writes to read better, right? You can't easily do it. You have to decipher a bit the system of this person, so that you can even recognize them in different manuscripts at a time. And you do see like very unique ways of scripting, or something very, again, unusual. Maybe he does it just once in the entire work, just for something that for a mark that he actually uses tens of times. Right, and you don't know what's up there. If maybe somebody intervened, which happened as a correction while he was writing with the same pen, so that makes the work telling you something that you have. So what did happen historically? What can this tell us about how they used to write to write manuscripts? Right. So the thing. Is fascinating, because sometimes you can find out why certain choices, why certain works, and everything goes again in ways that you are brought just to acquire with a long work that I skipped completely because I mostly work with non-archive sources, so I hardly ever need to read manuscripts in my post-university training. In my university training and after it. And I, generally speaking, however, am fascinated with what can be found out. I'm, say, friend with now some former university professors I made exams under that are famous international experts, and they study pretty interesting things. And it happened, for example, that I was this is not strictly connected nor with the Carolingian era or with manuscripts, but at some point I had read, for example, the work of an author that was in my opinion practically inventing the passage on a battle while following an acronical. And I asked and claiming that he had some original letter from someone who had been in the battle. And given that that someone was, and also this author was quite close to the interests of that a professor that I knew, who was an expert in these things, I wrote him, and I basically told him that what that guy had written about the battle was unreliable, at least on the basis of the sources that we have. And the first thing you would think is that, he had another source, the one he boasts and says, I have it, but he doesn't quite add anything from it that is recognizable from it. He just seems to still follow and to just remodulate the text of the chronicler from which he would keep following throughout the entire work without many diversions. And the paleographer told me, well, actually we don't know, because we don't have the source that he claims to have. We don't know whether he actually ever read it, what was written in it, or whether there was any info on the battle for explaining how it happened in that passage. So we were just thinking of how this guy could have reasoned and why he had that information turned out, and all the historiography had basically given for granted that he knew. He said, I made a paper in which it was explained how, in my opinion, he didn't know anything, and he invented the passage because he was saying pretty inconsistent things, not just for the internal logic of the battle, but also with some general information that if he should have at least kind of referred to, or proving that, because it turned out the letter did exist and he had it, and somebody else even knew that. So it's a historical thing, but was written in it, nobody knows. So it's a bit these mysteries that you can never solve, but that if you get a bit more in depth in the likelihoods of history, like that is, give me nothing is certain, but there is a percentage, a 70%, an 80%. That's something that you learn, you acquire as a sensitivity, as a general understanding of what could be the case, really. So it's all very somehow complicated, of course, but it takes to get in it to understand, because otherwise, as most things, you will not practically get anything from it, and that's what we mostly complain about all the time, that we don't teach anymore people to really be skeptical in an intelligent sense, or critical in an intelligent sense, and just everything is just either a plot, a conspiracy, or whatever, and every judgment, every information is somehow lazily gathered, and just say, I don't know, maybe, but I don't care. When our sciences have gone to the point where we know an atrocious amount of stuff that nobody cares, and nobody really knows that it exists even anymore, which is the kind of the most frightening thing. Like, how is it possible to even not having an eye? Of course, it's normal in some fields not to know the extent of certain things, but at least just comparatively with other fields, whichever you hopefully know, one at least, well, you should understand that things are a bit, let's say, always more complex and complicated than what they seem, right? So it's not that easy at all. In any case, we'll keep talking about the Carolingian Renaissance, medieval manuscripts, and other stuff in other videos. For today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.